Hey everybody, and welcome to Classical Stuff You Should Know. We're a podcast about, I guess you could call it neoclassicism.
Yeah,
Is that what we are?
Yeah, profound work of neoclassicism.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
Anyway, our aim is to bring to you the works of the classical world and old ideas and stuff in a digestible way, some way that is not horrible to listen to.
Like a little wafer.
Yeah, a tiny little knowledge cookie.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. Right? Little cookie of knowledge. But I'll tell you, the one thing I'm really excited for is this season of Lost. You guys know that's happening on a Caribbean island.
Can you tell me about it?
It's mostly about, it's singles. They're turning it into a reality
Wow,
show where they just soak them in alcohol and then see who will date who.
Sounds miserable.
But yeah, the title is Paradise Lost. I bet you guys saw that one coming, didn't you?
I did not until the very, very end. Graham has not cracked a smile at all.
He doesn't
this
like
entire
this at all.
intro.
He's not into it.
It's pretty good, but
It was rough. I'll admit it. It was not my best intro ever.
but you got us there. That's what counts,
yeah.
okay?
The real, the requirement was met that I begin with a bad pun.
Sure.
Yeah, I guess we're sort of on Paradise Lost.
That's what you told me.
No,
if
it
you
is.
lied
It's
to
true.
me.
No, I didn't lie to you.
You said it was on Paradise Lost, and my whole intro was based on that premise.
It's good. So if you Google anything to do with Paradise Lost, or even if you go to the Paradise Lost Wikipedia page, if you become like a fan of the book, it's not. I even wonder if this is on the cover of this book. No, someone different. But you eventually, the art that is associated with Paradise Lost is almost inevitably going to be William Blake. So I even think
right there.
Yeah.
Satan arousing
Isn't
the rebel
cover,
angels.
Isn't that William Blake?
No, this isn't William Blake. On the Oxford
sure?
World Classic, it's not. It's Detail from the Creation of Light by George Richmond. I don't know who George Richmond is.
There are a bunch of William Blake pictures here. So Judged He Man.
Yes.
A bunch of them.
So, I mean, William Blake did a bunch of woodcuts, I think they are, or maybe not woodcuts. What are those things where you sear it into metal?
I think the woodcuts were.
It doesn't matter. But anyway,
the Doré did a bunch of woodcuts.
yes, Doré did woodcuts. But William Blake is. I even was when I forgot my Paradise Lost book at school. I went to the like a PDF from I think it was Dartmouth. Dartmouth has like a Milton school. I think it was Dartmouth. And the banner picture on the top of the Dartmouth Milton blog is William Blake. It's a picture from William Blake.
This seems weird.
No, this is fine. But the William Blake is 100 years. So William Blake died in 1827. Milton died in 16 something.
Really? I thought Milton was way more recent.
No. So Blake is like a fan of. I mean, Blake is not a contemporary. Blake is
1674.
Yeah. So 16 what?
74.
So like 150 years, right? Is Blake? It's death. So this is and to have these guys be so closely linked. And there's a reason for this, and it's that Blake is, well, first of all, Blake's a crazy person. We've talked about him on an episode before.
Total nut.
Just an absolute...
An episode that was published on his birthday, right?
I know. We posted, I feel kind of bad about that.
Accidentally published on
published on his birthday, was like retweeted by the William Blake Society or whatever.
I was like, they clearly did not listen because we had some words about Blake.
I think we ended with, like, we should never teach this in a Christian school.
That was literally literally, yeah.
But William Blake is somebody who and I made reference to this in middle of Magby's last episode, where during Romanticism, there was this weird group of romantics who dressed up a lot of romantic thought using Christian stories and Christian imagery. And Blake is a big one. This is we're not really going to be getting into how Blake did it. You can go listen to the old Blake podcast. But for Blake, people who love William Blake sort of have like a little like replacement guide. Whenever you talk about Satan, you're really talking about this. Whenever you talk about God the Father, you're really talking about this. So whenever you're talking about Satan, you're talking about like the rebellious spirit of man wanting to be free. Whenever you're talking about God, you're actually talking about like the stony law of nature. Whenever you're talking about the Holy Spirit, you're really talking about like man's sexual desire or whatever it is. I don't think that last one was.
Like,
I don't think that last one was right.
Not the last one, but I just mean like that kind of one-to-one.
Yes. So Blake
allegory.
does this, and his whole like his tombstone says that he's like a poet and a prophet. Like he really believed that he was coming and bringing this new packaging of Christianity, or like the like what Christianity actually is, using all of the stories of the Bible.
Well, he was one of the precursors of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, right? The rebellious spirit.
Yes,
I mean, he
yeah.
wrote The Marriage of Heaven and
He
Hell.
wrote The
where
Marriage
it's
of
like,
Heaven
you
and
just
Hell.
gotta be free.
You
and-
just got to, yes. That God's sort of laws try to repress our desire, but he secretly wants us to like bust out. Anyway, all this kind of stuff. And that a lot of the Romantics were influenced by Blake, and when they read Paradise Lost, they interpreted Paradise Lost through Blake, or at least through that sort of romantic ethos, where when you're talking about Satan, you're actually talking about like, you know, the industriousness, rebellious spirit of like impassioned man.
Which Milton did not mean.
Well, this is a great question. So if you ever go, and this is how I was taught Milton. I was definitely, when I was in college at the University of Toronto, and I had my first Milton class. I don't even think I took a course on Milton. I think it was just like a survey course of Romanticism. Milton was in it, which is really which is interesting, because Milton is not classically or typically romantic,
Right.
But there
Because of
is
those-
a huge sort of school of interpreting Milton through Romanticism that is almost taken as like canonical. Like, this is the way you interpret Milton, to the point where it even colors sort of Milton itself. The Wikipedia. I was even looking through the Wikipedia article, and there was a couple of times where the Wikipedia article of Milton, I was just looking at it, I think this morning or last night. There's a couple of like citations needed, which is always
a good sign.
which is always a an indication that we're now getting into crisis land on Wikipedia.
Sure.
Or it's like my favorite like backhanded like come at me, bro. Somebody else is wanting proof, but there's a couple of citations needed where it's talking about the motivation of what Eve did something,
okay.
why Eve did what she did. I think it was like Eve was actually the smarter of the two characters, and that's why she followed Satan.
Yeah.
And there was like a citation needed. But there's this history of interpreting Milton that comes through Romanticism, and it usually is always crystallized in that one question that probably every introductory Milton class starts with. I don't ask this question in my class, but the one that I was asked in college is Satan a hero or not in Paradise Lost? Is he someone to emulate or not? And Romantics would say yes. Satan is the hero of Paradise Lost. He represents like, you know, the true feeling self crushed by like the law of society, and he wants to go like build his own society, and just like you know, the mind is its own place kind of thing.
Can I read you the Wikipedia part about this?
Sure.
Satan's status as a protagonist in this epic poem is debated. Citation needed. Milton characterizes him as such. Citation needed. There you go.
And the thing is, then you go and read, and this is what sort of opened my eyes to it, is you go and you read, so my own sort of personal story. Therefore, reading Paradise Lost as an undergrad, in my mind, I go, oh, Milton's not Christian because he is sort of subsumed into the Romantics, and Milton is just like a proto Blake.
Right.
That, you know, he inspired Blake, and since Blake was like kind of wackadon, or when Blake was sort of reinterpreting Christianity for this like romantic mission of his.
Right.
And if Milton is the guy who inspired that, well, then Milton must also sort of be in this category as well. That was what my young undergrad brain thought.
But William Blake does count Milton as one of his influences. Like
I think so. I mean, he does all the paintings of his
Okay.
work.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah. Then you go and you read. I read C.S. Lewis's Introduction to Paradise Lost, and you read it, and the way that Lewis talks about Milton is he talks about Milton as if like he's one of us. Like, he talks about Milton as a great work of the Christian imagination, and so he talks. There's a whole chapter about how Milton's theology is very much like Augustine. He talks a little bit about like that Milton does have a heresy maybe latent in the story, where Jesus is kind of like presumed to be created, but it's just sort of because you get into trouble when you're like creating characters that are God in a like in a
Yes.
book.
Or when like Jesus arrives on the scene instead of being there always.
Yeah, so it's like Milton actually creating Jesus. So it's sort of unclear, is Milton actually a heretic, or is he just like writing himself into heresy?
He also says the angels are kind of made of goo.
Yeah, this ethereal mold that they can turn into whatever shape they want.
Yeah.
So Milton is, he's got creative license, but when Lewis writes about Milton, he writes as if he puts Milton alongside with Dante as being, he's sort of like the Protestant Dante, many is according to Lewis. And so this just sort of got me thinking about like that Milton kind of got absorbed into a philosophical debate 200 or 100 years after his death, and he kind of got reimagined to be the banner of that movement. Is it retcon? Is that the
Sure. Yeah.
Is that what? Am I using that word correctly?
So it'd be a retcon if Milton meant it differently.
Gotcha,
And then
okay.
later it was changed to be he actually meant it this way.
So what is that? Where like you decide that what you're doing is you're going back and you're like, I don't know, you're holding up this story saying like, well, what Milton was really doing was that he was like the first romantic ushering in this new age of like feeling and therapy or whatever. Maybe it's not retcon, but
Isn't retcon going back and changing a piece of a story to
Yes.
fit what's currently happening?
I'm trying to think of like, we actually have a lot of this kind of thing in our kind of reboot world where we are rebooting shows and where we are sort of like reimagining these either television shows or movies. But in that reboot, we're also feeling like we're correcting the problems of the past.
Right. But that's, and I assume this is where you're going. The question, it would be a retcon if Milton meant it a different way.
Yeah. No, so it's not a retcon, so I'm not using that word correctly.
okay.
But when you have...
No, I'm saying Milton didn't mean it mean Paradise Lost
Yeah.
the romantic way, did he?
He did not.
That's why I think you're correct in your
Oh,
usage.
okay. So, but then you've got Blake doing these paintings
Yeah.
of, and he's saying like, here is a painting of the scene in Paradise Lost, but it's all wrapped up in like Blakeian craziness. And so then we've now, in 2022 when we think of Paradise Lost, we think of it as being this book. So much so that when we're putting together our Blake website or our Milton website, we get Blake banner ad pictures for it.
Do you think they're wrong to do that?
I don't think they're wrong, but what I think it is an example of is that the Romantic movement really was needed to have a violent reimagining of the past in order to like coalesce into its own thing.
Right.
So, we'll get there in a second. So, the best example. So, I've been reading Carl Trueman's "The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self." Hey, Joe, you looking up pictures of Blake?
Yes.
Yeah, and from Milton Paradise Lost. Yeah.
Because I thought maybe what had happened is that they just took pictures from The Marriage of Good and Evil and were sort of foisting those upon Paradise Lost. Nope, he has illustrations just of straight
Yeah.
Paradise Lost.
And
Because they're not bad, like they're good pictures.
they are great pictures.
But I'm assuming you're saying there's like an interpretation in the painting that colors.
Maybe. I haven't really gone as far. I mean, if you are someone who knows William Blake, you would you can't look at those pictures without sort of knowing what William Blake's doing.
Right.
So when he's like drawing God,
Right.
he's drawing the giver of the stony law, which is not how God is portrayed in Paradise Lost. So the God of Book 3 of Paradise Lost, or even the God described in Book 12 by Michael at the end, when Michael's saying like, "Listen, here's how God's going to fix everything." It is not the giver of the stony law. It is the loving God that brings that does the crucifixion of Easter Sunday. So, the Romantic movement almost like absorbed Paradise Lost and used it as its like launch text into talking about Romanticism, and Blake is kind of the linchpin with that. Okay. But you have people like Mary Shelley, and Mary Shelley does this with Frankenstein. So her story of Frankenstein is a pretty conscious retelling, or she uses a lot of language and a lot of imagery from Paradise Lost. And I'm teaching Frankenstein now to my kids in 10th grade, and we just finished Paradise Lost. And so my 10th graders are picking up on all the allusions. Right. They're like, oh, Victor Frankenstein just said he carries a hell within him. That's just like Satan. Oh, the childhood that is described as Victor and Elizabeth, he describes them in the same way that Milton describes Adam and Eve. But one of my students this year said something that I thought was really insightful. And they said, Mary Shelley is describing, is using, putting Paradise Lost into Frankenstein, but it's a cartoon version of Paradise Lost.
Sure.
Like, and the example was the childhood of Victor and Elizabeth in Frankenstein. Like, Victor's this like kid who loves science and he wants to know everything. And Elizabeth just loves flowers and all she cares about are like beautiful poems and flowers. And that, the student said, was kind of like a cartoon version of Adam and Eve in Paradise Lost.
Sure.
That if you just took a cursory read of Paradise Lost and were to describe Adam and Eve, you would describe Victor and Elizabeth. Sort of like science kid and flower girl.
Yeah. Is that fair to call the romantic reading a shallow reading?
Maybe not. No, I don't think it's. I think it's fair to call Frankenstein a shallow reading of Paradise Lost. But
Okay.
but what Blake is doing is not shallow. What Blake is doing is like a total reimagining of
Paradise
Christian symbols for that sort of romantic deal.
But I think there's a name for a certain group of people who thought Satan was the hero, the Satanists, which is confusing label.
Sure.
But I think theirs has to be a shallow read. He is not a hero, and we.
Is that not a part
Well,
of the
the
romantic
joke
reading?
is that Milton is that the Romantics stopped reading past book 4. Like that's the joke. Is because as soon as Satan becomes a snake, he's clearly pathetic and sad and laughable.
Like, even the moment he shows up in the garden as a frog and then they catch him and they're like, put him over there. And he's like, do you know who I am? And they're like, yeah, no, who are you? We don't care. Go sit over there. And they like, just these random sentry angels that have no, he has no power over them. And some random little Abdiel angel, even during the battle, clonks him on the head and just smokes him. So it has to be a shallow reading if you come out thinking he's the hero. He looks like a fool.
Isn't what AJ's saying a part of the romantic reading?
It is, yeah. So no, there's definitely a shallowness. I don't necessarily know if it's a shallowness, but I think it's Carl Trueman. I've been reading The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Has a really great definition of romanticism that I want to give you. And let's see if I can find it here. What page is it on? 27. So his definition of so this is what he says to talk about romanticism. The Romantics grounded ethics in aesthetics, in the cultivation of, and these are important words, empathy and sympathy, confident that a universal shared human nature provided a firm foundation for such. And he's going to go on to say that Nietzsche then sort of builds on that and changes it, and Marx builds his own version of that. Sure. But his whole point is that what the Romantics are essentially a group that are trying to postulate a new ethic of what human beings should do, why human beings should do stuff, grounding it in aesthetics, grounding it in questions of beauty and taste. And the reason they think they can do that is because they're confident that that universal shared human nature was a firm enough foundation to be able to like build an ethic on. So instead of talking about what ought, they can talk about like what all human beings know they or how can I describe it?
What they all feel?
Either what they all feel or just like the famous Rousseau, go look at savage man in nature and you'll find your ethic, right? Mm. Okay, but those words of empathy and sympathy, I think, are key because this is a big hallmark of the big romantic turn is that they saw Satan as the hero because they sympathized or empathized with him. They felt sorry for him, and by having his actual real inner turmoil and anguish depicted by Milton,
he's made to be sympathetic.
He's made to be sympathetic.
I hate this.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so when they see Satan say things like, wherever I go am hell, myself am hell, no more from misery from myself can fly. Like when he says these sorts of things, the Romantics basically go, "Oh, buddy," and then there's that sort of sympathy for him.
I've been there, pal.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure.
And then there's a build-in,
He feels sad like
and
I
so
feel
then that sympathy ends up becoming a the platform for building him up into basically somebody that they can either relate to or that he is in fact the hero.
So not just a hero, but like a tragic hero.
A tragic hero. You need to look at it from his point of view. If you went through what Satan went through, you would feel the same way. Don't judge a book by its cover kind of stuff.
But Milton means those punishments or those negative emotions differently.
I think so. I think Milton.
They're like punishments for things.
I think this is still the debate. I think you can definitely read Milton as Satan legitimately feels that way. The despair of the soul in rebellion against God is a real despair. He's not just like an evil cartoon like devil, with goat horns going, "Ha ha, I'll get you," right? Like his despair is real. But his despair isn't something that we should sympathize with. Like the despair is sort of justly deserved.
Well, I think sympathy is okay. Like I think what Milton is giving is maybe
No, go for it. No,
is maybe an honest depiction of evil. Like we either in the modern world either say evil is not a thing, or we make it a cartoon version where evil is like evil. Evil is that cartoony thing, but real evil is often regretted by the person committing it, and often what they have done is made their own life a living hell. It reminds me. I think one of the best modern depictions, like in popular culture, is probably Thanos, right?
Okay.
He knows he's got to do this evil thing.
I don't know what this is.
It's
Yes,
from
you do, from
Marvel.
Snap guy?
Snap guy.
Yes.
So he wants to do good for the world, and he's tortured, and it has made his life horrible. Right. He has to be horrible to his kids and horrible to everybody, and gosh, I wish the guy would have spent 10 more minutes thinking about it and would have created double the resources instead of killing everybody. But it seems like an actual good depiction of it, kind of like in Crime and Punishment, right? His sin makes him feel awful.
Okay, but so we tie that back to sympathy.
So what I'm saying is, I don't think that sympathy is, like, I think maybe it's a medium, right? Satan's punishments are just and deserved, and I think Milton is showing them that way. Milton is also showing him as sort of a sympathetic character, because we should have sympathy for someone who does evil, and yet their punishments are still deserved. It's a medium in between the two, whereas the Romantics are saying he's sympathetic and poor abused guy, like God is all up in his business. You need to say, yes, it's sympathetic, but that's the deal.
I think.
You chose sin.
I guess the romantic. It's the next move that's really important. Okay, so the sin of Satan or the fall of Satan can engender sympathy. Okay, now what are we going to do with it? What do we do with the character of Satan? You can feel bad that he is in despair, but the Romantics will then sort of normalize that despair and turn him into a hero. So, the book Frankenstein is actually wanting to do that. It's creating the monster and putting him in the same place, kind of as Adam, and then kind of as Satan. And so here's the monster who was rejected by his creator, and he feels bad, and he goes off and he burns down things, and he's a monster because of it, because he never really got a fair shake.
So is it the difference between tragedy and justice? Like Milton meant that despair as a part of the justice for his sin, whereas the Romantics say it is tragic that he feels it.
Yes. So the Romantics would not see what happens to Satan as just. They would see what happens to Satan as a depiction of us as well.
Sure.
And so then the book Frankenstein is taking. And that's not what Milton is saying. So Milton is saying that
I think Milton is saying is that it's justice.
It is a just
and the despair that he feels is sad, but that's part of the deal. Like,
and then
it's
the Romantics come in, like Mary Shelley comes in and says, "Nah, that's not what Milton means. What Milton means is actually like that God rejects us, and because God rejects us, we are in despair. But that despair should be turned back to be. We should be angry that God didn't give us everything that we needed. Like Frankenstein is justified in his anger against Frankenstein."
Yeah.
And so then you have this like little reimagining of Paradise Lost, so that you can't go and, I mean, you can, but the Romantics then change the interpretation of Paradise Lost with their sort of absorbing it into their canon, if that makes any sense.
Because Milton wasn't trying to muddy things up by making Satan sympathetic.
I don't think so.
I guess
he might have been.
We don't
maybe,
really know.
Yeah, we don't really know.
But the Romantics will use that as a means to reinterpret the entire story because of the emotion of it, and not because of the like actual facts of the case of he's Satan, and do you know what I mean? Like that he deserves the punishment that he gets.
Yeah, they will sort of ignore the rest of Christian orthodoxy that the book posits from basically book 5 to the end. I mean, the book is, I think it's thoroughly orthodox all the way through. But
with some fiddle room,
of course, with it being like weird fan fiction, you're always going to have like wiggle room.
But AJ's response before is like the right one, isn't it? So it's fine to understand the emotions that is protagonist the right term? To understand the emotions of Satan, the main character of the story, but it shouldn't distract from the message of the story. It shouldn't distract from Milton's intention with it. I feel so easily pulled in the direction of, if we're going to show sympathy towards Satan, it's just very hard to avoid then blaming God for sure what happens to Satan.
And I think that's what the Romantics end up doing,
right?
Or if not explicitly, implicitly, and then I think explicitly later.
Or at least with Frankenstein.
With Frankenstein, it's a little bit more explicit, and then sort of the further down you go, you get to the points where people sort of take ipso facto, Satan is the hero of Paradise Lost, and God's a big giant jerkbag. And Milton, that wouldn't be the reading that's not how it's written.
Right.
I mean,
it's also funny that the affinity with Satan as opposed to Adam and Eve, the two humans in the story, who, sure, they're kicked out of the garden, but you described that they talk with one of the angels and they're told how it's all going to work out.
Yes.
Anyway.
And there's a similar thing that happens with Eve, that a similar kind of move happens with Eve, where there's a reimagining of her motivations coming from Romanticism and sort of the burgeoning beginning of feminism with Mary Shelley and Mary Wollstonecraft, going back and sort of reimagining Eve's motivations for eating the fruit is like, I mean, at some point you get it to the fact where it's like Eve's eating the fruit, being like, screw the patriarchy, like, and
which is not in the
which
story.
is not in the story of Milton, and so the fact that something that is when C.S. Lewis reads it, he says, this is one of our stories. This is a Christian story. And then when the Romantics read it, they say, hey, Milton's like starting to do this new thing. Milton's got this new thread that we're going to pull. And of course, maybe he couldn't say exactly everything he wanted to because of his backwards day and age,
right.
wouldn't have accepted it. But deep down, he was kind of one of us. And so you kind of have these two camps claiming ownership, and then building out these sort of interpretive frameworks around the book. And what I think this is a great example of, like the mission of what the Enlightenment is trying to do. Mm-hmm. So maybe you and I were kind of even talking about this before we recorded the episode, a little bit after we talked about your episode on Leopardi. And that was, what was the definition that you had said? Maybe it wasn't of the Enlightenment. What was it?
No, it was about the term post-Christian. It was from it's a John Mark Comer podcast. I don't remember the name of it now, sorry. It's him with an Australian co-host. Sorry, I don't have it in front of me. But he was defining what the term post-Christian means, and his definition was that post-Christian is seeking of Christian ends without Christianity.
Yeah, and one of the definitions of the Enlightenment that I've kind of heard talked about a couple times, I think maybe Andrew Kern talked about it at Circe, but I've heard it batted around before, is that it's an attempt to keep the fruit of Christian society without any sort of appeals to the transcendent Christian story, or as we get further down, any kind of appeals to anything transcendent. Yeah. So you want to have a grounded ethics. You want to have a so some sort of definition of goodness. You want to have some sort of appeals to truth in the realm of science. You want to have some sort of appeals to beauty in the realms of art. And you're wanting to keep sort of the fruit of Christian society without sort of using the transcendence. And so I think that the Romantic interpretation of Paradise Lost is like an example of trying to keep the fruit, trying to keep the fruit of Christian society, but getting rid of all that like nasty Christian orthodoxy stuff.
But then I'm missing some connections between the sympathy, empathy point on the Romantics to that. So like, what are these ends that they're trying to keep? Is sympathy, is that a new end, or is that, do those two ideas go together?
Yeah. So Truman, I think, what he does partway through his book is he tries to draw the link between romanticism as this sort of attempt to create an ethic apart from like objective morality, like positing God and God's law, and banking it just in sympathy. So we even saw this a little bit in the Candide episode, right? Like, atheist character walks around and sees somebody doing something terrible to somebody else and feels like this is a bad thing. And that's all we need. We just need to be able to like observe the world and then be able to draw our ethical conclusions. We don't need to be told that thou shalt not murder. We just need to, if we witness a murder, we're going to know it's wrong. Yeah. Why? Because we wouldn't want to be in that guy's place getting murdered. So
therefore don't murder.
And so therefore don't murder. And the driver of that was a sympathy, was I don't want to be in that dude's place getting murdered. And so then a sympathetic analysis of somebody else's life should be the grounding of our ethical framework.
Okay.
Which I don't think is wrong, but I don't think it's something that you can. I don't think it's the sufficient condition for the ethical framework. The Romantics, I think, try to argue that it is. Okay. That just by being sympathetic, we can build a framework for ethics of what we can do. What Truman points out in the book is that this actually starts down a really uncomfortable road of humanizing monsters, where you get this. You begin to look at the other side of the coin so much, or the bad guy's point of view so much that we totally blur the line between good and bad, and we actually can sympathize with the bad guy because he's coming out of an honest place, and we can sympathize with him. But sort of do this writ large, and this becomes sort of a more can actually lead to some places where we're just sort of creating people that don't have healthy fear of bad things. Yeah. So we in our AMA we were talking about books that we didn't rate, and I think I jokingly said The Wheel of Time, and maybe you said one of the reasons you liked it was because of its good guys are good and bad guys are bad, right?
It's straightforward. Yeah.
Do you think that kind of book is where good guys are good and bad guys are bad that's still like a way of that young adult stories are still centered around that framework?
I don't know if I read enough like in that genre to know. Again, Wheel of Time is one of the best-selling sci-fi series of all time, and Brandon Sanderson had to write the last three because I forget the author's name, but he died before he could finish the series. But anyway, there's some popularity there. I take your, but again,
my point is that I just think it's even. Sorry, go ahead.
So what Truman's talking about, is he talking about literal monsters? Like, does he talk about Twilight and vampires and like vampires are good now?
I think so.
I forgot if he got that specific, but like that's, I think, spot on. In Twilight has, it's a small subset of all books written, but just think of like how what is historically like just like a clearly evil monster now is totally personalized, actually is the hero, actually is a good guy.
And what's the enemy? Well, it's a society that rejects him.
Exactly.
And I think, we can kind of be, tongue-in-cheek about it. But I even think if you start looking at lots of like kids shows and kids movies, it is a lot of humanizing the bad guy or humanizing the other. So you've got like Despicable Me. Well, it's the evil genius mastermind that's actually the hero, or I don't know enough kids stories to know. But there's whereas like you go back to like Sleeping Beauty and the witch is evil. Yeah. But then aren't there even more like modern Disney where it's like the story's told from the witch point of view? Like, isn't Maleficent about the witch?
I haven't watched it, but yes, she's the main character, and there are Disney Channel shows that have like the bad guys as they band together. I haven't watched
exactly. So it's that kind of sentiment. Now, I'm not saying that these shows are like inoculating kids against questioning morality and therefore humanizing monsters. And
take AJ use Thanos as the example from before. Like that's the biggest blockbuster movie of all time, and it's like it's literally about how the bad guy had some good points, right? Like that's that's an entire 30-run movie series to make that point.
This even happened in Star Wars, where all of a sudden the Empire has some sort of sympathetic sides to it with the Clone Wars. And anyway, my point being that like that taking the idea that it is a good thing to look at the world from other people's point of views. That is and sympathy. That's a good thing. But the Romantics start to sympathize Satan and then create Frankenstein, or create the monster in Frankenstein. And you sort of continue to get that moved forward where Satan then becomes sort of the actual hero, and what we are is not people trying to fit into an imperium made by God, but are people who are trying to sort of find our place by fighting against that imperium or being on the outside. And isn't that kind of like awesome? And so, yeah, so saying that this is an example of the taking of the Christian whole and wanting to keep the fruit of it, but sort of discarding the orthodoxy. There's probably a whole podcast we could do on how the Romantic poets thought that they were rescuing beauty from like boring, stuffy Christianity by creating their poems. But I mean, it is pretty quick to go from like Romanticism to Impressionism to Cubism to Marcel Duchamp putting a urinal in the Louvre, right? They're all in the same ethos of like looking at what's come before you and kind of like smashing it and trying to reinterpret it moving forward to something. Well, even the Italian guy we were talking about last time.
Where like standards could be held onto for a little while, but it's always that problem of like, how do you train the next generation? So like your current generation was trained in these like methods of make stuff that's actually beautiful, but then that's thrown off and not passed on, and then you get to Dada. You know, I guess it's a century later or whatever, but but that's kind of still the direction of it. The throwing off of standards leads to no standards being passed on, right?
Yeah. So, and then we have this. Then we almost have this like sort of this thicket of interpretive muck to move through, so that like it's really hard to talk about Paradise Lost without talking about without also talking about the history of how it is interpreted. In the last episode we were talking about how like Dante is in a world that is done. Yeah. And Leopardi is in a world that we live in. Right. And so reading Leopardi, we're like, oh yeah, this guy understands humanity. Sure. And you read Dante and you're like, what's this old world that he lived in? Like, I don't even have a frame of reference for understanding what he's talking about because
it's so different.
We don't believe in that sort of the imperium of sort of Christian order.
Sure. I'm waiting for you to go the next step and then say that sympathy and empathy are bad, or that the Romantics were wrong all along.
I was just going to ask, do you not like the Romantics? Like, you're not down with those boys?
No, I don't. I mean, I think the Romantics have attempted to.
Hot take.
Yeah,
you don't like the Romantics?
I don't.
That's pretty hot take.
No, I think what the Romantics are attempting to do is they are attempting to hold on to standards of beauty apart from, or if we think of like beauty as a branch, like you cut the branch off from the tree, it could flower for a season. It could flower for 2 seasons. There still could be some vigor in that branch, but it's going to die. The Romantics cut the branch off from the tree and are still super jazzed when it flowers the first time, and then when it starts to die, write poems about how sad they are about death.
Sure.
Whereas, and that everything and sort of lament.
And eventually, future generations are like, "What tree are you talking about?"
Yeah, exactly. Yes, there are no trees. Yeah. We chopped them all down.
Because does Truman start his history of like the rise of individualism with the Romantics?
He does, so yes, pretty much with Rousseau.
Okay. So do you buy that as a?
I do. I think so. I think that the turn to saying, I mean, you could go further back and go Descartes. I think the turn to the individual as the man as a measure of all things was the beginning of that. That's essentially like a very Enlightenment phrase, the man is the measure of of all things, is kind of the ethos. So I just kind of for my own self jotted down some notes that if we take the three big pillars of classical thought, classical education, truth, beauty, and goodness, the Enlightenment attempts to give a framework for truth, for beauty, and for goodness under that turn to the individual, or as what Truman calls the therapeutic man. So goodness in the realm of ethics, right? So you go from Descartes, I think therefore I am, or I doubt therefore I am, to Hume, to Kant, to Nietzsche. Like that sort of that progression of thought goes from who is this agent that is doing the doubting? And it's like, oh, it's me, the human. I'm the center of this, and I'm going to be the thing that works itself out. To Hume, who is sort of saying, like, show me the experiment. To Kant saying, like, how would you summarize Kant in a sentence?
The basis of ethics is reason.
Yes, the basis of ethics is reason. To Nietzsche saying, like, the basis of ethics is, like, can you throw down, right?
Yeah. Sure.
And so that's the progression of Enlightenment thought when it comes to ethics. It's kind of this like this trickle down to just force.
I feel like Nietzsche would have loved MMA.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. He'd been a huge MMA fan.
Yeah. Nietzsche would love social media, or he would just like, can you just sort of wield your
social clout.
Yeah, your clout.
Others. Yeah.
Okay, let's do the same thing with beauty. And this is sort of where the Romantics more fit in. Beauty, you have the sort of the idea of perfection or the classical ideal. And then you start to get into the Impressionists, which is we're actually not going to go with the ideal. We're just going to have impressions of images. We're not going to try to like depict something realistically. We're going to depict an impression of it.
We just got to get that feel.
We just got to get that feel. To then sort of the Cubism, which is we're going to get the feel and it's going to be a lot more disjointed. To as I said before, like Marcel Duchamp, which is talking about like
I made a yellow square on a paper.
Exactly, or the urinal, or that kind of thing.
Sure.
And if you're really interested in that,
become an artist, AJ. That was just great.
The thing is, like,
please.
if you ever read the stuff next to those things, it's just a paragraph of gobbledygook
behind all this. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. And I want to be the artist that just puts a yellow square on a paper and writes, I put a yellow square on a paper, and see if it sells.
So,
can you tell I'm not a fan of modern art?
Yeah,
it's really hard.
I'm
It's
building
hard to
up
tell.
to something that Carl Truman mentions, which are called death works. We'll get to that in a second.
Pretty edgy. I'm sorry.
That's not like a machine where we put people and make them into juice.
Or it sounds like a German
Put him in the death works.
German metal band.
Welcome to death works.
Yeah, so that move of beauty is like we're trying to hold up to the ideal, to the artist basically like daring the audience to say this is ugly.
Yes.
And if you're interested in that movement, there's there's a documentary put forward by Scruton, is that his name? Roger Scruton, called about beauty, which he sort of traces that specifically in the art movement. It's fantastic.
He scrutinize?
He does scrutinize it, yes.
Oh, okay.
And then
I had to check.
And then when we're talking about truth, so we've talked about order, we talked about ethics, we talked about goodness in terms of ethics, we talked about beauty in terms of aesthetics, and then truth. The Romantics are truth then becomes a subjective thing. So truth is something that is observed by first of all the artist. And so in those poems that we read in the last podcast, or what William Blake is doing, or what the Romantics are doing, I wandered lonely as a cloud. It's the artist is the
center.
is the center, is the observer, and then from that you get to
Teen angst
Freud.
poetry.
That's where we're going. But you get Freud, which is sort of like the psychoanalysis, and then you get to the modern man or the modern self, which is all centered around like identity politics and therapy and or the expressive individualism is, I think, what.
I'd say in consumerism, like there's like an economic angle to all this too.
Yes,
right?
that
it's all oriented toward getting you're happy, so you're going to give me money, right?
Yeah, and I think everybody realizes it at some point that there are all these like subgenres or these like subcultures that you can be a part of are just little economic machines that are a part of the same beast.
Be yourself like
can
everyone
I be?
else.
Am I going to be a skater punk? Am I going to be a goth kid? Am I going to be a jock and shop at Abercrombie? Am I going to go? You know, like.
And there's a way to buy something that
That's right.
expresses
And you
all
can
those,
fit
right?
into all those things.
I want to do a mix. Abercrombie goth.
Abercrombie goth punk. Well, then you've created a new market, and now it's going to cater to you, and you can just create your own subreddit, and then off you
Goth
go.
or Crombie.
That's awesome. The Enlightenment experiment has reimagined truth, beauty, and goodness, and this is not something that I've come up with. That I think there was a book called "Why the Enlightenment Failed" or something like that, and it's sort of tracing this. It's you have this belief that human reason and putting man as the measure of all things is how we're going to base our understanding of society, and then 300 years later, you have, like what we were talking about in the in-between episode, like teen depression rates at 47%.
Well, eventually you're just like, oh, sheesh, well, we can't agree on the reason.
Yeah.
So Nietzsche's right when he's like, well, it's going to be whoever can throw down.
Because the romantics start from this, and you get this in Romanticism and Enlightenment. You expect these common human things across everyone, and then you realize there are sociopaths.
Yes.
It's like, well, what do you do about that? Because all I can appeal to is this common shared humanity.
And how many television shows do you have which are sympathetic to sociopaths? Like that's,
Sure, right.
like Dexter.
I was just thinking Dexter.
I never watched that show.
Neither did I, but because I was so frightened, or I was so turned off by the fact that it was like, we're going to take something which happens in the real world, is people killing people for the sheer joy of it.
Right.
We're going to put a veneer of sympathy on it in the narrative world.
Doesn't he kill bad guys?
Where he's only going to kill bad guys.
No, he kills serial killers.
And he kills serial killers, and then you can watch that and like it. But if you don't have the sophistication to be able to take what was like fiction and not bring that into the real world, like people could be like, oh, well, maybe there are real Dexters out there, and this guy that I started, emailing who's in prison is maybe a real life Dexter, and then you're in all sorts of problems.
To be fair, they didn't. From what I remember of the show, they didn't make Dexter seem that sympathetic. He was not a friendly person.
But he's still the main character.
And there's still probably like Dexter fan Instagram pages out there.
So, you guys can tell me why I'm wrong. There was
have a list.
Okay, there was a push at Veritas a few years ago against the humanizing of villains, right? That evil needs to be only evil.
Really? Was this like a curriculum thing?
This was a thing. It was probably 7 or 8 years ago.
Okay.
And I always bristled against it. Number one, I think storytelling is fine when we want to see the inner workings of evil. I think what the problem is not that we villainize evil and say this is evil and it's only evil and it's not good and it should be opposed to good, but that we've lost an understanding of what evil really is, and that it is like a crippling weakness coming to bear on a person, and that if they stay in that weakness, it will destroy them. Right? I think that actually depicted in a show is sympathetic, but also just. And if to bring up Milton, right? He showed Satan not as pure villain, but as a person lost in his sin who was getting his comeuppance for the choices he had made, which is what sin really is. I don't want Frankenstein to be, or Frankenstein's monster to be only monster. Neither do I want the same thing of, like, I kind of wish in Beowulf, the bad guys were a little more sympathetic, because they are depicted as cartoonish evil. And what happens when we have only cartoonish evil is, I think, kids lose the notion that, like, sometimes a little slip, they're like, I'm a pretty good person, like, I'm not a monster. And it lets them slide down that thing without realizing, okay, these small steps, this is what evil is when good has gone a little bit screwball. Like, I have to stop there, because that is when things go wonky. I have always been uncomfortable with the push to make monsters pure monster, because it cartoonizes the whole thing. And students don't learn that, I guess I already said it, but they don't learn those small shades.
Yeah, I'm tracking with you until you say that the reason we shouldn't do this is so that the child themselves doesn't feel bad when they mess up. Like, I don't think worrying about how the child thinks about themselves. Therefore, we should humanize evil.
No, but this is the point, right?
Mm-hmm.
The reason we wouldn't humanize evil is to help teach them about evil. But my point is that it doesn't teach them about evil. Real teaching about evil shows that it is a darkness, a wickedness, and a weakness that comes over a person, and it can look a lot like good.
I just think it requires that last part. So, and I agree, it's similar to what you said before. I'm totally on board. If it's taught from there are bad decisions that lead to punishment that you shouldn't follow down that path. That's one thing, which I think is separate from there are bad people who bad things happen to them and we need to make them feel better. That's not the same thing.
Yeah, that's not what I'm talking. Yeah.
Correct, but I think that's more what Graham is commenting on, and I agree with you that we all make bad decisions. We should see that making those bad decisions leads to bad outcomes, but that's not quite the same as what Graham is commenting on. Of we kind of lose all responsibility. That I'm a bad person because my parents were mean to me when I was growing up. Therefore, I'm not in charge of my actions right now. Therefore, I need sympathy. I need people to feel a certain way toward me.
Yeah, I agree. And what I guess what I'm advocating for is not full movement into the romantic view, but the medium that actually happens in Milton, where the character is a little sympathetic, but it is painted as this is a weakness, and yes, he is stuck in this place, but that is the right place for him to be stuck, and this is what evil does. Sure. I think that is what is good to teach kids, not. I
think I kind of disagree. Okay. So think of Goldilocks.
No, we have disagreement. We don't have disagreements.
Think Goldilocks and
Three Bears.
Three Bears. No, where's the one where she gets eaten by a wolf at the end?
Red Riding Hood.
The big bad wolf. What's the big bad wolf? What's that story?
Red
Riding Hood. Okay, the big bad wolf. The big bad wolf wants to eat you, right? Pretends to be your grandma. Pretends to be the woodsman. Whatever the story is, wants to eat you. So do you have that story? I think that's a great story to teach the kids. There are big bad wolves out there that want to eat you. I think then when you've got the
why is the wolf bad?
Then you got the Disney Pixar Big Bad Wolf movie where it's like everybody hates him because they're scared. In Pigland or in Little Red Riding Hoodville, the Big Bad Wolf just can't get a break because everybody hates the Big Bad Wolf, and he's like, "Why do people think I'm bad?" And then the whole movie is about how it takes society needs to figure out that the Big Bad Wolf isn't as bad as it is, and when he does all these great things, he then becomes the mayor of Little Red Riding Hoodville. And the little kid who watches that movie is like, oh, the big bad wolf in the world is actually somebody that if I just got to know, I would actually like them. And I think that's a dangerous message to teach the children.
Fully agree.
Yeah.
We are totally on board on that. And by humanizing the villain, I don't mean lionizing the villain. I mean showing what is actually going on inside their heart. I think that's okay. What I'm against is the 100% we are only okay with black and white evil depictions. I don't think that's a healthy way to be. So coming back to Dexter, right, which we used as an example of humanizing the villain, right? In that show, he is, and I have to admit that I watched it, he is haunted by what he is doing. Even though he does it, and he is constantly almost getting caught. Everyone around him is on the verge of finding out that he is this horrible person, and yet he does it. And he is conflicted about what he's doing because, yes, they're evil, but doesn't that mean he is evil? And so he is caught in this, a place that maybe I read the room wrong, and he is a sociopath, but a place of despair. He is constantly on edge. He is not enjoying himself. He is haunted by the things that he's doing. And I think that is a good depiction.
Does he get away with it, or does he get punished?
I think he gets.
Then that's terrible.
Or whatever.
But my point
the show
is
would be so much better if he gets caught and thrown in jail for life. And it's it doesn't. I don't care. You're a sociopath. You killed a bunch of people.
But this is my point: is that doesn't happen to everyone who's evil. And as long as But
if you're telling a story,
let me finish. Let me finish. I advocate for depictions. I like depictions where they show that one of the ends of evil is not necessarily just punishment by outside forces, but internal punishment. How many kids are actually going to get caught for the stuff that they do? How many times do you?
But we never get away with it, right? The whole point is that there is punishment and justice in the end. At least that's the Christian understanding of it. I don't think that Satan's despair is the end of it. I think the fact that it's Satan's despair because what he realizes he's despairing because he doesn't have God. I think a story where I think something like Dexter is they're trying to get away with it. They're thinking like, it'd be actually kind of cool if we told a story about like a good psychopath. And they're like, well, people aren't, we got to do it in a way that like people are going to swallow it, because we can't just like put an evil guy on we'll have him feel bad about it. But he still gets away with it at the end. And it's like, okay, when the movie...
So what if he gets caught? Does that change the show for you?
It does. If he gets caught and thrown in jail forever, it changes it. Yeah. It's like the movie Wall Street, right? When whoever directed Wall Street, he said, I wanted to write this movie because I wanted people to see how terrible greed was. And then you like created an entire genre of like Wall Street bros that loved that movie because they're like, this is awesome.
Sure. Same with the Coffee is for Closers, the Alec Baldwin thing.
Same with Alec Baldwin, same with Scarface. Yeah. I think gangster movies are another great example of this, where you put up the gangster and you're like, oh, he's just doing it because he loves his family, and that's why he's like chainsawing women to death. And so isn't he cool that he dies on a mountain of cocaine at the end? But I think like by even just depicting and showing that, we just as like human beings, we will always be looking for the sympathy in the person, and by humanizing it, you get to this point where, fast forward however many years since Scarface, and Scarface is now sort of seen almost as this like weird folk hero, and he's in like every dorm room poster.
Sure, yeah.
But that's a misunderstanding.
It's a misunderstanding by design.
Because the story
was set up to make him sympathetic. Huh. Whereas I don't.
So Dexter gets arrested.
Does he get thrown in jail forever?
Yeah. Well, I know.
Does he get executed?
I don't know. I don't think it goes that far.
Anyway.
But he does get caught.
That's funny. Is that they just put out like a new last season? Is it from that?
I'd have to look it up.
Anyway,
but anyway, my point being that like...
I'm just saying he got away with it for 6 seasons. Or
that I think that the
Season 7.
Yeah. There it is.
So you have,
He does get caught.
That...
And I wouldn't say dying on a mountain cocaine is a good thing.
By
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Wow.
I'm fairly sure.
It's not a good thing, but I mean, like, by putting it into the realm of imagination and by putting it into pictures, we're getting back to our can art be evil question, which we always I
think we are largely agreeing, and I actually kind of agree with you that when it is done in such a romantic way as to lionize or over romanticize the person who is suffering, then that's probably bad. Like in Scarface, right? Or in Fight Club, right? Those guys end up in a terrible place. He's shot in the face by a gun, but you come out of that thinking, oh man, what a romantic guy. Like he's got...
And he blows up a bunch of buildings.
He's got schizophrenia, he blows up some buildings, and he shoots himself in the face.
Right.
But you end up thinking he's cool. And I'm with you that that's not great.
Yeah.
And that's why I like Paradise Lost so much, is I think it is a good medium between the two, where Satan seems romantic for the first little bit, and you're taken in. You're like, oh man, this guy, he's kind of the hero. And then later you're like, man, he's just watching them like as a frog. That's kind of dumb. And then he's like, I'm so cool. Why don't you know my name? And they don't care about him anymore. He's not as famous as he thought he was.
And then at the end,
he's basically just a hissing snake full of garbage. Like he's just spitting trash, and everybody knows it. And I like that kind of ending. And you're right. I think maybe 7 seasons of Dexter getting away with it, and the Willy won't he is not good unless we see a mental and spiritual decline over that time into total degradation, which is what would happen, right? To quote Chesterton, you can never maintain a level of bad, right? You will always sink deeper and deeper into degradation. You cannot be romantic bad all the time.
Now, I've never watched the show, but if they had a companion character who who was like the police guy, who like lived his boring life, and he had like 2 kind of well-behaved kids who loved him, and he never cheated on his wife, and he kind of paid his taxes and lived in like kind of a dumpy house in suburbia, and he catches the guy at the end, and you can kind of contrast these 2 people's lives, then maybe you're getting to the realm of doing something that's not just over-sympathizing the bad guy.
I think you might be talking about, it's been a long time since I've seen it, and I didn't watch more than like half a season or whatever it was, but maybe a whole season, I don't remember. But I think what you're talking about is the other cop. But knowing cop shows, she was probably tortured and alcoholic.
Yeah,
that's just the way cop shows
go. Which is terrible.
Sure.
But my point being that like and we're running out of time here. My point being is that we've kind of, as kind of modern storytellers, and this has started with Romanticism, is that we've kind of got this shtick of take the bad guy, or take the outsider, or take the other, or take the despicable, or take the thing that people kind of think are bad, put them in a story where we can massage it in such a way that they look good, and then use that as an example to point to the fact that that morality is just relative. And I think that let that program run over time, and you get to the place where you can kind of start lionizing really bad stuff.
I fully agree with you on that. Yeah, I think we're on the same page.
But the Romantics are. But you go and you read the Romantics and you're like, well, they're not doing this. Like, it doesn't feel like they're doing this. But you take the mechanism of what they're doing, and then push that 200 years in the future. Right. And in art, you get toilets in the Louvre, and then
that's just convenient.
And then in identity, you've sort of got the modern therapeutic sort of fragmented self, and then in ethics, you've kind of got the sort of Nietzsche will to power. So it's kind of this basically like this sort of a more barbarous age. And that's Truman's point.
And this has been Classical Stuff You Should Know. On that happy note, we'll see you later. I guess you can contact us if you want, if anything matters in this world, at classicalstuff.net. That's our website. You can email us at theguys@classicalstuff.net.
Things do matter. Telling good stories is matter. Telling stories of like good people living like ordinary lives and being happy is anyway, whatever.
As long as I'm in the middle of it, that's what's really. Yes. As long as I'm the observer, I think that's the important thing. And if I can figure out what's right and wrong for myself, I think that's the important part.
You are the main character.
Of course, I'm the main character. That's why I'm talking right now. Exactly. Is I'm the main character of the podcast. Yes. We've always known. And then, you can patronize us, patreon.com/classical stuff, and you can tweet at us at CLSSCAL stuff. And I think that's it for us.
Yep.
Right? We got some more stuff to do. And if you get on the Patreon, you can hear in between episodes and some other cool stuff like AMAs, and we might even answer some of your questions if you throw them at us. And all right, I'm tired of talking. I'll see you guys later. Have a great and wonderful Tuesday.
Bye.
Because you deserve it. I mean, if you think you do, and if it's right to deserve it. I don't know.